Mention an interesting story about Shilpacharya Joinul Abidin. He painted a lot in the 1943 Famine. But why only single?
So I had only ever found one, right? But somebody, I've been in Dhaka for the last few weeks, and somebody, a Bideshi look actually, came up to me and said, actually, there are 5 Joinul Abidins. He found that the son of Joinul Abidin has one. There's one in the museum. There's a few others in private collections. So he's tracked this down. He'll be writing an article in Prathamalo soon. I was in my friend's house on Tuesday. He's a rich guy. He's not like me. He's a rich guy. He's an art collector. And we were talking again about famine in 1974 and so on. And I said about Joinul Abidin. He said, oh, I've got one of those. And literally in front of my eyes, on the wall, there it was, 1975, Brahmanbaria, October. It was a very tragic sketch. There are some more of them. But I tell you what's so interesting, I was thinking about this. In 1943, his pictures caused a national scandal, an international scandal. You know, these pictures, they went to the UK, they went everywhere. Everyone was horrified to see what was happening in Bengal. It became a public issue. In 1974, those pictures are in the collections of elite members of the society. Nobody sees them. Nobody even knows about them. But they're becoming more and more valuable. They're very valuable pictures now. Isn't that ironic?
How you can connect 1974 famine with 1943 and the Irish potato famine, as your mother is from Ireland.
That's my mother's one.
And your father is from Rangpur.
That's right.
There's a strong connection
yes,
between Ireland and Bangladesh.
Absolutely there is. Absolutely. Actually, my mother was the first person who told me about famine. When I was a small child, I had a book about Irish history with some pictures of children starving, and she explained to me what a famine was. You're right, there's always I wouldn't say man-made, there's always a politics of famine. Famine is always a political issue. It doesn't matter whether it happens from a natural disaster or whether it happens like it's happened in Gaza in the last few months, deliberate starvation, forced starvation. There is a terrible thing that happens in a famine. Many terrible things happen in a famine. But one thing that I find very interesting that is politically significant is it allows a powerful government or whoever to experiment with different strategies, to experiment and see what happens. These people are helpless. They will take any food, they will take any assistance. You can do all kinds of things when people are starving. Some scholars of the Irish famine have said that, you know, in the Irish potato famine, as they call it, in the 1840s, that the British government was experimenting with all kinds of capitalist ideologies, capitalist policies, trying out different kind of social welfare models on the Irish. They thought the Irish were just the lowest of the low, so they were disposable. Similarly, I think in 1974, I've written about this, but it's hard to prove. I'm exploring these issues. I think that for the Americans, there was a sense in which they'll see what can they do with food aid. If people are starving, can we get their government to align with the policies that we like? There was a very famous book at the time called Famine 1975. It was an American book, which was very influential. It's a terrible book. It's a really bad book. Very racist, very violent and horrible. But this book said essentially America has all the food aid. America can get to decide who gets to live and who gets to die. And there are definitely some people in the US State Department who had read that book and had thought, oh yes, look, I have the food aid, I can decide. So there's some kind of experimentalism that goes on. And this is partly why this book is called The Aid Lab. I think after 1974, Bangladesh became a place where all kinds of experiments were happening. I write in the book about...
was it good for Bangladesh? If you see the story of South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, they developed a lot comparing ours.
Yeah.
Aftermath of 1974 famine, what you see? Was it the aid service or aid that was flooding Bangladesh? Was it good for Bangladesh?
That's not exactly how I understand it. What I think happened after 1974 was, certainly there was a political crisis we all know about. And I think that thing taught the Bangladeshi ruling class, the Bangladeshi elite, that they would lose legitimacy and they would lose political power, maybe even their lives, if they were allowing people to starve, if on their watch, even if it wasn't their fault, even if they couldn't do anything about it, if it happened, they would lose their legitimacy. They would become an illegitimate government. This, I think, was the basis of a kind of a social contract. After 1974, we never had a famine. We should have had many famines. Bangladeshis were very hungry, very poor. There were many disasters.
And overpopulated.
Oh, well, that's another controversial issue. I will talk to you about that another time, perhaps. So the politics changed. Another thing that changed was the policies changed. Bangladesh became a real pioneer for policies that were pro-poor, targeting the poor, targeting rural women especially, with different services, especially food assistance, cash assistance. Bangladesh has had, until recently, I don't know what the situation is now, I must admit, until recently, a really quite effective system for managing hunger. So, we have the VGF, the VGD, the OMS, the test relief, all these programs in the rural areas. OMS is in the cities, of course. But all of these really came up after the 1974. And they do two things at least. They help to stabilize the price of rice so it doesn't go too high, it doesn't go too low. If it goes too low, that's not good either. But it also means that those, in that moment when people are hungry, they can get something. They can get some help. That was a pioneering thing. The other thing that's interesting is you look at the organizations like Grameen Bank, BRAC, all of these very innovative social organizations. All of these came up after 1974. BRAC initially was started after Bhola cyclone. But Grameen Bank, Professor Yunus has written about his experience as an economics professor at Chittagong University in 1974. He's an economics professor, and then he's looking at the famine and thinking, what can economics help me understand here? And this is really the foundations of the Grameen Bank. So this relationship between the elite and the rural masses, this one changed. Because I think in the mindset of the elite and the middle classes, their idea is that, okay, Tigatsi, everyone in the village is fine. Somebody is taking care of them. There is a traditional social system. Don't we think that still? Actually, the famine showed that that was not working. Nobody was helping those people. That was broken, maybe because of the war, maybe because of decades of poverty.
Role of women is another important issue, interesting point after 1974 famine. If you see in the garments, more than 40 lakh women are there. And in the microfinance, women are the key character. So how you see the women engagement in Bangladesh policy making from micro level to macro level?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that it's really, you're based in Bangladesh, you're always here. If you go to other countries, you'll be surprised how not accepted it is that women should have a role. In Bangladesh, people really accept it. Even people, maybe Islamists who don't particularly want women to be public and so on, even there's a great deal of acceptance of a role for women for many different reasons. That, I think you really need to read Naila Kubir's new book. Naila Kubir is a professor at LSE. In fact, I think she's retired now. She's written about Bangladesh and gender, women's empowerment and so on for decades. She did her first study in the 70s. I think it's Tangail. And she went back again now, 50 years later, and she went back to those same people to understand how women's lives have changed and how women played such a role in changing their own lives, but in changing the country as well. I think 1974 was a moment when it became accepted that women could not stay in the home. Nobody was feeding them if they were in the home. Many women were widowed after the war. And the extreme poverty, the crisis really broke some of those traditional norms in a way that was never reconstructed. I think in particular women's right to work, to earn incomes, because otherwise who's going to feed their family? I think this was really established. I think also the Bangladesh government, Bangladesh state, I should say, whichever government came afterwards, always did see a role for women in the development process. You have to think, we have no wealth. We have only our humans. We have our people. This is our wealth, right? You said overpopulation. I would say we have a an abundance of human resources. Who is it that makes those human resources? Who is it that rears the children, socializes the children, teaches the children, turns them into citizens? It's the mothers, it's the women, it's the families. I think all of the governments recognize this. So women became agents of development very much, I think.
How this book is relevant today and how we can learn from the failure of 1974 and how we can check this type of catastrophe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of things are lessons from that. One is the need for a government, for a state that is listening, is hearing the problems of the people, that is capable, is not so insulated by power and by wealth that it's not able to listen. Obviously, the best way for a government to be accountable is through democracy. Bangladesh's democratic experience is less than its non-democratic experience, right? But even then, many governments have been good at listening, even if they weren't elected, until they become too powerful, until they become too arrogant and too insulated. Especially around hunger issues, they have listened. So the kind of state that we need, a state that is capable of listening to people's problems, is crucial. You need to have resources. You need to have food security. You need to have the kinds of relations with other governments that enable you to import if you need to, but you also need to be producing enough and storing enough. Storing enough food is important. At one point, the World Bank advised the Bangladesh government to close down the go-downs. Close them down, just buy it on the international market when you need it, they said. And then the 2008 crisis happened, and India wasn't exporting any rice. Bangladesh couldn't buy any rice. The price of rice shot up a lot. Do you remember this? The last caretaker government, that time. These are two important things. You need to have a government that is capable of knowing what is going on, not just listen to the people, knowing what is happening in markets. All of this is really, really important. I always say two things: political commitment, state capacity.
This famine occurred in 1974. Why not in 72 or 73, immediate after the war? And what is the reason behind it? Is it conflict of ideas, ideologies, or mismanagement?
So I think what we know now is that famines are always very complex issues. They always happen for a lot of different reasons. But ultimately, those of us who study famines, we all say that ultimately, a famine occurs because it's not prevented, because the government, whoever is the authority of the day, sometimes famine occurs in places where there's no functioning government, but whoever has the power to act, those people fail to prevent the famine. Going back to why it didn't happen in 72, 73, this is an excellent question. There was some research that was done at that time, in which it was said actually, in a sense, that there was a kind of famine, but it was exported with 10 million refugees who went to India. So in a way, there was a kind of a famine situation for sure. Bangladesh had a famine-like situation for decades, before and after 1974. But governments got better at managing that situation. In 72, 73, there was a lot of foreign aid after the war. That started to dry up. Started to be much more development focused by 1974, not so much relief focused. So you asked, was it a clash of ideologies or was it mismanagement? It's a lot of things. It's a lot of things. I think that I have looked very closely at whatever literature is available about the famine, and it was really quite well documented in the 80s. There was the famous Amartya Sen essay on famine, which uses the 1974 famine as one of the case studies. And there's also the Mohiuddin Alamgir book I was mentioning, which has got very rich empirical data, original data collected. So there is quite a lot of, good information, but it stops around about the 80s. We never talk about it again. Very, very rare papers or books or discussions about it after that. From those books, I think you can identify maybe 4 causes. I think probably 4 is a good way of thinking about this. One was we had massive floods that year. The Jamuna burst its banks 6 times between June and September. So a lot of crops were washed out, a lot of people were displaced, and there was no work, there was no jobs to harvest the crops. And this meant that all the din mojuri, the wage labourers, the landless wage labourers, who were a growing number in Bangladesh, they didn't have any work. A second was we call it the famine economics. The price of rice was increasing very, very fast. In fact, between 73 and 74, the price of the basic rice doubled. How did that happen? It's not entirely clear. It's not entirely clear how that happened. Some of it was smuggling. Some of it was hoarding. Those syndicates that we are still talking about now, they were very much active in those days as well. But essentially the main point of famine economics, this theory, is Amartya Sen's theory, that is said that basically it wasn't because there was not enough food, it's because people could not buy the food. They did not have the money to buy the food. Partly because the price rose so high, partly because they didn't have any jobs. A third part of the explanation is that Bangladesh was very dependent on international food aid at that time. The government was bankrupt. It was bankrupt. There was an international oil price crisis, OPEC oil price crisis. A bit like 2024, the situation was similar. The price of oil, of energy went very high, the price of food went very high. And the government could not import in 1974 any food. They asked the US government a year before the famine, they begged them for help. And the US government said, "You have been trading with Cuba. Cuba is a communist country. It's against our law, Public Law 480, the law that allows the food aid to be sent. And so you can't have it." So they delayed for a year. After the worst of the famine, then they sent the food. When most people
USA had the role in that famine.
Absolutely, absolutely. Nobody has really studied this since Rehman Subhan. Professor Rehman Subhan wrote a very important article in Economic and Political Weekly. I can't remember if that was 1979 or 1980, something like that. Very important article. Everyone should go and have a look at it if you can access it. Yes, and the reasoning there are many reasons possibly. I don't think we really know exactly why they did it. I remember asking Professor Nurul Islam when he was still alive. He was one of the first people I gave the original copy. The original book was published in 2017. He was still alive. I went and gave it to him, and he said, "You're wrong. If I were the American government, I wouldn't have given it either." He said, "It's our national interest." He was a very interesting and obviously very clever man. But I think the reason that they withheld the food aid is partly they wanted Bangladesh to go in a different direction. This sort of socialism, non-aligned policy during the Cold War was very problematic for the US. So they wanted Bangladesh to do as they were told. Also, I think Bangladesh was kind of irrelevant. It remains to some degree not an important country geopolitically. So they didn't really care what happened. They had many other things to worry about. But there's a fourth reason, a fourth cause, which is really this question of administrative capacity, the weakness of the management of the state. You must remember after the war, Bangladesh was devastated. There was very, very limited local government capacity. There was very, very limited resources, no food to give out anyway. The Awami League government at that time did not really have the authority. It was not able to hold local government to account. It couldn't really deliver the food aid. There was some corruption also in those Longokhana. But the real problem was, this is the really big political question, I think, about the famine, is that they had they depended a lot on food aid, but that food aid mostly went to middle-class people, to essential worker categories. Do you remember the TCB ration? I think it still is there, but in those days, in the 70s, the TCB ration shops were mostly for government employees. If you were working for the government, your army, you work in a big factory, then you could have those rations. It didn't go to the poor. And the government, maybe it could have said, okay, you're middle class, you'll do okay. I'll take away your food rations and give it to those rural poor people. They didn't do that. They didn't do that. Whether they could have done it, I don't know, but they didn't do it. Partly because they thought those people living in the big cities, they're more politically active, they're more of a threat. Perhaps they thought that. These rural people are starving quietly. I don't know if they ever really knew the extent of it. The official numbers are very low. They say 28,000, something like that, died.
And you mentioned 1.5 million died. So why government or the officials try to hide up the numbers?
I don't know if they did try to hide the numbers. As I say, I don't think they have very good numbers from that time. You've also got to remember that Sheikh Mujib was killed in August 1975. People were still dying from the famine. Famine is not like one short thing and then you die next week because you didn't eat for 3 days. No. People don't die from starvation. People die because their body gets destroyed by hunger. Their heart, their liver, their kidneys. That's why they die. They start eating things that they shouldn't eat. cattle feed, leaves, these sorts of things, and they die of different diseases. And it goes on for a long time. And the food prices remained very high until late in 1975. I do not think that the Awami League government of that time ever really had a handle, never really knew. This book that I'm citing the 1.5 million figure of, this is by Muhyiddin Alamgir, Bangladeshi economist. The book is now out of print. Nobody talks about this number. It's a very careful analysis that this number comes from. It is cited by all the famine scholars. It's accepted. I'll tell you one other person who has cited this figure is Dr. Abdul Razak, who was the former food minister under the Awami League. He's also a scholar of food security and nutrition, I think. He has cited this number not so long ago, in the 90s, I think. So those who know about this issue know that this is a realistic number. Actually, I think it's considered to be quite conservative. It may have been many more. In those days, we didn't have a good, strong Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics like we have, relatively speaking, now. Nobody actually knew even how big the population was. Nobody knew who was hungry where. All of those things have changed a lot since 1974.
Why the culprits are not punished, or why the culprits are still not in the scene?
So who are you going to punish for mismanagement? What will you mismanage if you don't have any food? If you don't have any money to buy food, who are you going to punish?
It's mentioned that some store force syndicates are also there active.
It's very hard to prove that, and they did do that. I think that did happen. I think a lot of houses, a lot of households.
Famine is always man-made issue.
I think I would never say anything as. I would never make such a big statement. Famines are always many, many issues. I don't know about man-made. Would you say the floods were man-made in 1974? I wouldn't say that. That was one factor. Would you say the OPEC oil price crisis was man-made? Yes, perhaps, but not by someone in Bangladesh. Would you say the Cold War, which was a factor, was man-made? Yes, but again, who are you going to blame for that in Bangladesh? Many factors. I think also you have to think about, why do people starve? People starve because they've been hungry for a long time as well, They're malnourished for many, many years. And that was the situation in Bangladesh. When Bangladesh became independent, there were some studies that showed a huge proportion of that population in those days was malnourished, was poor, already before the war. So who are you going to hold accountable? I think it's a great question. I think it needs more work. I'm one person who's written one book. We need many, many more studies of such a the worst catastrophe in our history, actually. And still people are very shocked when I say 15 lakh people died.
Huge
15
number.
lakh, huge number. I asked a friend of mine today, she's an older person, older than me anyway, in her 70s, and I said, how many do you think died? She said, maybe 1 lakh. And then I said the number, she said, oh my God, I didn't know. Nobody knows.
Oh, you